And we obviously come at this a little bit different. The very first date, it wasn't an official date. We were just walking around the golf course, Joy and I, and getting to know one another. And she said, just to make sure we knew up front, she's not going to waste her time on any guy who wasn't going to, cut it. She said, I want to have 6 children, and I want to adopt 6 children. And so I thought, well, okay, that's all right. I was tutoring her in math, so I just thought maybe it was a math problem. But we're real close. We've had 6 children and adopted 5. And there have been another 10 or so that we've adopted in our heart, and they fell through for one reason or another. And that's always, that's just as painful because, in your mind and your heart, you've made a place in your home and your heart for these children. And for whatever reason it doesn't work out, it's, again, very painful. So let's just give you an idea of our family. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the biblical obligation we have about taking care of the fatherless. And one reason I do that is because, when I was at Florida College, I was a Bible student. I had preached for a good while already. I knew James 1:27 was in the Bible. I knew a lot of these other verses. But it really wasn't on my mind or radar at all. And if I could do anything to help raise awareness, just to start at least thinking about the responsibility that we all have to care for the fatherless. It doesn't mean you have to adopt. Adopting is one way of caring for the fatherless. We all have a responsibility to care for them. We don't necessarily have a responsibility to adopt them. And so as we think about these passages, we can think about ways we can help toward that end. And I'm going to begin with Psalm 10 and in verse 14, talking about God. You have seen it, you have beheld mischief and vexation to take it into your hand. The unfortunate commits himself to you. You have been the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. Nations have perished from his land. Lord, you've heard the desire of the humble. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to vindicate the fatherless and the oppressed, so that man who is of the earth will no longer cause terror. And so, when we learn that God is a God who takes care of the fatherless, it's not surprising then to find out that over and over again throughout the Old Testament, we're told that we are to care for the fatherless. And these are the passages, I just put them up here. Some of these talk about the problem of being fatherless, that it is a curse, it's a terrible thing, or the injustice that people take advantage of those that are vulnerable, like the fatherless and the widows. But several of these are exhortations to us to take care of the fatherless and the widows. And so I'll just read a couple of these in Deuteronomy chapter 10 and in verse 17 and 18. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great and mighty, awesome God who does not show partiality or take a bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. And how exactly he does that becomes apparent just a couple chapters over when we look in chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. And this, again, is just something that Deuteronomy says over and over again. At the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that town, deposit it in your town. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, the alien, the fatherless, the widow who are in your town shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. And so over and over again we see that God wants the fatherless to be cared for, and he's given us that task of taking care of them. And of course the New Testament passage that comes to mind, that the title of the life enrichment events modeled after is James chapter 1 verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion is to take care of the orphans and the widows. And the one unique thing about that passage you have to understand is in the culture of the first century, taking care of orphans and widows was not the kind of prestigious, credit-getting kind of activity that it is in our culture. For Christians to go around saying, "Oh, I took care of Widow Jones, and I've taken care of Orphan Smith. Look how great a Christian I am." And that'll get you a lot of, street cred with Christians. But in the ancient world, it wasn't that way. And there are cultures like that around the world today. For example, we adopted a couple of teenagers from Crimea, and it was part of Ukraine back then. And that's the attitude that they have about kids that are in the orphanage. That's kind of, karma, you or your people, your bloodline are bad, and that's why you are, where you are. And it reminds me of the old Arab proverb, when you pass a blind man, you should kick him. Why should you be kinder to him than God has been? It's that kind of mentality, fate or God or somebody's the one that has given these people their due, and for you to alleviate their suffering even is meddling in things above your pay grade. Well, that's not the attitude of the God of the Bible, but we have opportunities to serve. And Joy and I have discussed this many times. How do you know our hearts are big enough to adopt every child who needs a home? That's clearly physically impossible, financially impossible. And so what do? Well, I feel about it much the same way about poor people. As Jesus said, you'll always have the poor. And I can't help every poor person. If I was the richest person in the world, I could easily give all my money away in a matter of seconds and just not even make a dent in world poverty. But if God puts Lazarus at my doorstep, then God expects me to do something about Lazarus. And God in his providence brings, people into our lives. And I think the same thing is true, is every time Dana Carosa has called us and said, "Can you provide a home for this child?" We've discussed it, and there's a lot of factors to weigh in making that decision. And we've said, yes, we can. And once you make that decision, how do you say, "No, I will not do that"? But even if you say, "No, we can't," or "we can't right now," there's still these other ways we can donate our time, donate money. The cost of adoption is just legally so prohibitive. Most people can afford paying to put clothes on the child's body and feed them, and but the initial upfront cost could be just too prohibitive for some people. And so it's really a shame if someone's willing to provide a child a home, and the real barrier there is not having the legal fee money. And if there are those able to bear that cost, again, that's clearly a way that we can go about doing that. Now, of course, is what Sacred Selection is trying to do. One of Dana Carosa's favorite statements is, if all you have are money problems, you don't have any problems, because that's pretty much easy to solve and deal with. So I hope that just makes us reflect a little bit more on ways we can think about taking care of the fatherless in our own circumstances as we have opportunity to do that.
I appreciate that. I'm going to go next. Before I get into what I was going to share, kind of telling you a little bit more of where we're going to go, I'm going to share a little bit of our perspective on how we have viewed adoption, what's happened in my family. Then we're going to come back and we're going to share some of the lessons that we've learned, both of us together and our families, through adoption. And we'll have some time for conversation, discussion, questions that you might have. I hope that you have some. It's really difficult to try to figure out what exactly to talk about in a venue like this when adoption has been such a big part of our lives. I do want to say, when I was talking with Dr. Hamilton ahead of time and he was mentioning all of these passages of Scripture that deal with taking care of the fatherless, it's kind of overwhelming. The number of passages, and he just read a few of them, but seeing those, I don't know what's kind of overwhelms me, the numbers that are there or the numbers that are there, but almost have a kid, I think, for every passage that we have on that next screen, but really showing how important this is. For all of us as Christians, that this is a responsibility, that there is an obligation here to take care of those who don't have families, those who don't have a father. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my family. It is not nearly as big as that other family, but we also have this experience through adoption. Stephanie and I have 5 children, and the first 4 are adopted. Hannah is here as a freshman now, but Hannah and Kira and Jonathan and Alexander were all adopted. And then Olivia was biologically born to us, our 5th child. So we did it in reverse order. And actually, our journey to adoption is a little bit different than the Hamiltons' journey towards adoption, and even our perspective on it. I will mention with Sacred Selections, 2 of our children, our 2 younger adopted children, were adopted with the help of Sacred Selections. Just incredible what they did, because we would not have financially been able to afford to adopt Jonathan or Alexander in those situations. But when I give a little bit of our perspective on adoption, again, our journey was a little bit different, because Stephanie and I had already been married for 10 years, 11 years, and we had been physically unable to have children. And so we're one of, maybe in some ways, the more typical adoptive family, where we weren't initially motivated out of feeling this obligation to take care of the fatherless or to help those who didn't have a family. At first, it was really more of this idea of just wanting to have our own children and wanting to start our own family. And one of the questions that I might ask, and really kind of see if you have some responses to that, I think some people are kind of selfish when it comes to wanting to have children for their own, but why do Christians want to have children? I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. A lot of people, they get married, they start a family, and then they say, well, we want to have children. What's the real reason for wanting to have children, if you rule out kind of the selfish reasons? And I'm not entirely sure what the selfish reasons are, but what is the reason for wanting to have a child? I'll wait for you. Who wants to share? Why should Christians want to have children? Anybody? Yeah.
That's God's kingdom.
Okay, to add to God's kingdom. A good answer. Yeah?
And I'd say having a kid, you know them all their life, and that's a long time to train somebody to go out and teach the word to others.
Okay. So when we're talking about influencing the world for good and doing some of those things, again, adding to the kingdom, yeah?
God describes our relationship with Him as a father and son relationship, so it can give more insight into at least the best description of our God.
Okay, that father-son relationship. I asked around some other, anybody else want to share what comes to your mind first? Because that's actually something, I hadn't really even thought about putting it into words why we would want to have children. I do think that relationship aspect is a lot of it. I asked a few other Christians even earlier today, I was like, why do Christians want to have children? And they came back with, to learn more about God, to learn more about sacrifice, to learn more about service, to learn more about love. To try to give love to someone else. The command to be fruitful and multiply. But as that relates to God's kingdom, giving glory to Him, having that kind of an influence on others, I think that's why most Christians want to have a family, why they want to have children. And for Christians who can't do that, when my wife and I were married and we're trying to serve God and we wanted to do that, that's kind of a struggle. We wanted to raise children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And my wife had always wanted to be a mother. That's all she ever wanted to be. She wanted to get married and she wanted to have children. I probably wasn't drawn to that as much as she was, but it's something I always looked forward to. And so that was a challenge that we found the answer to in adoption. And so we really did come at it from this perspective. We want to have children. We want to learn about loving others. We want to serve others. We want to serve God. This is the way that we can do that. And initially there were some who questioned that. I found it interesting, Dr. Hamilton talking about in certain cultures, there are those who don't see, they see if God's made you this way, well, then He's punished you. I will tell you, there are some who don't see adoption as the way to fulfill the desire to serve God. And we know through different conversations that we had with other adoptive parents, there were sometimes those who relayed this idea that adopting is circumventing God's will for you. People will actually go so far and say, well, if you didn't have children, maybe God didn't want you to have children. And, who are you to try to change that in some way and try to go out there and have a family when obviously if God had wanted you to have a family, you would have a family. And you have to overcome that you would have these children. And really there were questions regarding whether or not these are your children, which is also an interesting part of the story. Where people will look at that and say, well, they're not really yours. And you're, well, really? That's kind of interesting. I'm raising them. In our case, all of our children, we actually adopted from pretty close to birth, 4 days old, 1 hour old, 3 weeks old, when we adopted them, and we were the only family that they've ever had. But there were questions related to that, and maybe some questions regarding what kind of culture we were going to raise our children in. I know both with the Hamilton family and with our family, we have transracial adoption taking place, where you have parents and children who are of different races, and that comes into our culture and our society in quite a few discussions. Hannah was, our first child that we adopted, and she was black and we were white, and we had a conversation with the birth family, and they said, what kind of culture are you going to raise this child in? Are you going to raise her to be a black child, or are you going to raise her to be a white child? Which was also an interesting part of this conversation. Our response to that is we're going to raise her to be a Christian child. Our culture is defined by Christianity. It's not defined by these other aspects of our society. But, that was something that we had to deal with, and yet this became very natural. And this question, that arises, are they really your children? Again, I could share a lot of stories regarding that. One of my favorite stories is after Hannah was probably only a couple months old. We probably only had her home for a couple of months. Somebody at church one time, I was with her and holding her, and they said, are you going to tell her when she's older that she's adopted? And I looked at them and I said, well, if she doesn't know, then probably not. We probably have some bigger things that we're dealing with. So if she doesn't figure out that she wasn't biologically born to us, then no, we won't deal with that. And then they were kind of embarrassed, but they said, you know what? It had become so natural for me to see her with you, I didn't even think about it. I didn't think about the fact that her skin color was different than your skin color when you were together as a family. But, that's one of the things that we've been able to share. And I do think the amazing thing about adoption is that God does create a new family, which, of course, is what he does with every family. There are certain aspects of what we'll talk about with adoption, and I think even some of the lessons that we've learned. The truth is, it's the same lesson, it's the same thing, whether you have a biological family or not. God created man, God created woman, God created marriage. God created his design for how children come into the world. He makes that family, and we recognize that he makes that family. He joins the husband and the wife together, and he's the one that blesses them with children. Well, in the same way, he creates these families. And God does bring these children and these families together in that way. And it's not a secondary mechanism, or it's not something that's second best to a biological family. And that's where I want to get into the scriptures that I wanted to talk about tonight as well, because I think, again, sometimes even maybe the approach that we took is we got married and we first were thinking we would biologically have children, and it wasn't until after we couldn't biologically have children that we started to look seriously at adoption. And you might think, okay, well, that's a good fallback plan, if something else doesn't work, if we're not able to have children. But really, God did this with us in making us part of his family. And this is what he does spiritually for us. In Ephesians chapter 1, beginning in verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us to adoption as sons, through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the kind intention of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, which he freely bestowed on us in the beloved. And that's just one of the passages that I want to read. But here, when he talks about God predestined us to adoption, he predestined us for the purpose of adopting us into his family. Have you ever wondered why he uses that particular illustration? I mean, it's not the only illustration that God uses for how he creates this family. He does use the example of being born again. And so he could have used that here. We're just born again into his family. We're just born into that family. Or that we're transferred into his kingdom. Or we have this citizenship in his kingdom, which he uses in other places. Here he specifically used adoption. And I think part of the reason for that is because adoption is very much a conscious choice. Now, again, you can say biologically there's a choice that's made there, in other ways as we expand our family. But adoption, the adoptive parents, they know what they're getting into, and they choose a person to adopt. And it doesn't happen by accident. And so when, God says that he chose us, he even predestined us to adoption. I think that's what he's describing. and that we really are the children of God, just like a natural born child. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1 says, "See how great a love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we would be called children of God, and such we are." And he comes back in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1 and says, it's pretty amazing that God allows us to be called his children. But what's even more amazing than just being called his children, we really are. child being your child, and then that didn't happen. But I will say, for the 4 times that we adopted, we were contacted each one of those times. So we had originally reached out to, in another adoption situation that we'd learned about and tried to adopt in that situation, and that one didn't happen. But we received phone calls with our other 4 children saying, here's a child that needs a home. And we've been so blessed by that. All 4 of our adoptions were considered high-risk adoptions for various reasons. Hannah, next time some of you students see Hannah on campus, she was 3 pounds 4 ounces. She was a preemie. The birth mom did not know that she was pregnant. She was born before they knew that she was pregnant. So a teeny tiny little baby. Jonathan, of course, has been the biggest, what some might think is a challenge. He's been the biggest blessing in our family. But that's another one where everybody needs a family. I'm sorry to say that we did have some people question us. When we adopted him, we knew before he was born that he was going to have some sort of challenge physically. We actually didn't know what it was going to be. They did not diagnose the Down syndrome before birth, which is really unusual nowadays because all the prenatal testing can tell you Down syndrome. But they had identified all kinds of other things. I mean, they knew he was going to be really small. They thought maybe dwarfism was going to be something that he would be dealing with. They thought maybe some issues with his spinal cord. Of course, it ended up that his esophagus hadn't formed and didn't connect to his stomach. And so I think that's part of what they were picking up on some of those tests. But when he was born, he was classified as an unadoptable child. And we had people ask, why would you ever want a child that was broken like that? They just don't understand what God can do through people. He is an amazing son. He is an amazing part of our family that makes our family better in every single way. But you have to see, for who they can be. Same thing true with our other children. We have one of our others that a local adoption agency contacted us because they were having difficulty placing this child. And they knew that we were the type of family, because of our faith and because of what we believe, that everybody needs to have a family. Everybody deserves to have a mom and a dad and to be part of that family. So I do think that's a lesson that we've learned as well through adoption in a different way. So that's one of the lessons. Again, if you all have we'll have some time for questions and discussion. The second one, family's not defined by biology. That is not what makes a family a family. And again, our experience, we got to get this in reverse order. But one of the things that was brought up to us when we first talked about adoption, some people asking questions like, well, do you really think you would love that child as much if they were adopted as if they physically came out of your body? And of course we thought, well, yeah, we think so. And certainly as we formed our family, we love our children with all of our heart and everything that we are, again, being a choice, but also being an emotional connection. Then we got to experience on the back end of it, after adopting 4 children, a biologically, born to us child. And there is absolutely no difference in how we feel about these children and the connection that's there and the bond that's there between a parent and a child. Whether that's through adoption or whether it's biologically there. Stephanie jokes, again, sharing some of the personal stories of, out of our 5 children, the only one who seems to really question our love is the one that's biologically born to us. She's the one that comes back, you don't love me, you don't, and she's the one that throws that out. But it doesn't have anything to do with being biologically related to someone. It has to do with forming a family. And again, we understand that even from marriage. Hopefully you're not biologically related to that person that you marry. When you start that family, it doesn't have to do with that. It's having a family that's bound together by God. So, sorry, I would share on that. What would you want to add?
So marriage is a choice too.
Marriage is a choice
You
too.
adopted your wife.
She
She adopted another child.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
So
Let's stop that analogy and that illustration there.
well, of course, I think of Hebrews chapter 12, where the Hebrew writer is making the point that if we as God's children don't submit to His discipline and training, then we're illegitimate children because we've denied to God His role as Father. And of course, it can work the other way around, where if a father fails to discipline and train the child, then he's not really being a father. And of course, that is to say, if you got a guy who's a biological DNA contributor, but he doesn't provide the training and the teaching, he's not really a father. And so the primary definition of that family and parenthood is rooted in that relationship again, and we have to make a conscious, choice to do that. And that's kind of been our experience too. 3 of the 5 children we've adopted were adopted before, and people are well intentioned. They, want to do the right thing, help the fatherless. And this goes back to the point we were making earlier. I'm sure as Christians they wanted to fulfill the command, the obligation to help the fatherless, and felt they could do it this way by adoption. But then for one reason or another, really could not provide that unconditional love for that child. And through the experience we've had with adoption from the very beginning, we've gotten involved in a lot of situations where that is the case. And if you had told me how often this happens, I would have said, you're lying. But it happens a lot. And the thing is that the guilt that people feel from having adopted a child and then giving that child up, it's the worst guilt I have ever seen people suffer from. I've known a lot of people who committed adultery against their spouses, and it doesn't rise to that level of guilt they have, because they feel like we made a commitment to this child and we're reneging on that. We're probably ruining this child for the rest of their life. They'll never be able to trust anything anybody tells them. And I would say to that, children are resilient, and the last thing you want to do is create an environment where you're going to guilt parents into keeping a child out of appearances and what people will think, if they cannot really give that child unconditional love, because that's what makes a family. And so if for whatever reason, they got into it and they adopted a child because they thought it's like getting a puppy or a kitten, and then it gets older and they're like, oh, I can't stand this dog, here, let's get rid of it. I don't want to trivialize that that's the same thing that people went through, but for whatever reason they cannot love that child, then the act of love you have for them is finding a family that will adopt that child and love them as their own. And I constantly am calling Ami by my daughter's Bethany's name, and of course they look nothing alike. There's not a single physical attribute, except I think they're both women, although I'm not a biologist. And yet they are so much alike in character and so on that I constantly thinking of the one daughter in regard to her. So obviously I can look at my children and say their skin is a different color than mine, just like I can look at them and say, oh, they're tall or thin or whatever. But you have to stop and think about it. It's certainly, if you had told me when I was, in college, I could get to a point where I really was colorblind, so to speak, I'd have probably thought, I just don't see it. The culture is so steeped in it, but it really is possible, and so it really has nothing to do with physical biology.
That's a good point about wanting to make sure you can provide for a child what they need. It just reminded me again some of these things that could come out, and you may have questions about how we've dealt with birth families and how we've dealt with those situations. We have always celebrated our birth moms with all of our children. Now all of ours came directly from the birth mom, but when we've talked to our children about that, their birth moms cared enough about them to seek a better home for them, to seek some way for them to be raised in an environment that they couldn't provide themselves. And so we've looked at that not as a negative, not, your mom gave you up, your mom didn't want you. That's not what's going on. That's, in many cases, this is a mom who loves them enough to give them a home that they can't provide for them. So I think, again, that shows that it doesn't have to do with, biologically. I think one of the worst things you could do if you really couldn't care for a child is to keep it just because you're biologically related to it, and then not provide the love and not provide the nurturing and not provide the upbringing that they need. So,
well, and I'd say we've emphasized too that this is part of the path and the journey that God has chosen, has brought you to us, and we're grateful for each step along the way and the people that God has used to help make that happen.
and that's your next point, which you can go right off of.
Well, that's true.
Trust in God's providence.
In a way that I could never really have appreciated before. I think I mentioned we've had like 10 children that, for whatever reason, things would fall through. The first was a group of 5 we were going to adopt, and it would have been a interracial adoption because we were just going to adopt some kids from the system here in Hillsborough County. And, you know, they're considered special needs child because they're a sibling group. We thought, well, we can do that, you know, because we're kind of like the buffet, all-you-can-eat buffet. May not be the best food in town, but there's a lot of it. So we knew that we could handle lots of kids, you know, and so most people don't want to take a sibling group, and so we can do that. And so we went through all the certification and all the stuff you got to do, and then a couple of times they came up to be matched, and nobody wanted them, and our paperwork wasn't finished yet. And then this third time, there's like 3 families, and then the state matches them with another family. Of course, we're like, why in the world? Does God not think we'd be good parents, you know? And yet it was just a month later that we got the call about Nami and Andrew, which if we had adopted that one group, we would not have been able to adopt them. And it's kind of interesting how that came about, because that was the time that Stephanie was spending so much time in California, staying with the Carrozas, and had all the frustrations with Jonathan being in the hospital and trying to get him released and come back to Florida. And it was frustrating for them, and her being separated from her family. But she was there when Dana Carroza got this phone call from this Christian family that wanted to rehome their 2 children they had adopted from Guinea, Africa. And Dana gets off the phone and she says, where in the world am I going to find a family to adopt these children? They're older, you know, and people want babies. And, you know, there's 2 of them rather than just one, and they're of a different race. And Stephanie says, I know. And because we'd just been through that wanting to adopt the group of 5. And so that's how, again, in the providence of God and all the garbage they were going through, it all worked out well for us. And so, and we've just seen that time and time again. I can tell several stories about the ones that have fallen through, but through various experiences, eventually found good homes. And so ours was just a step on that journey for them, but not the final, you know, destination, and that was fine. There was 2 friends of Nick and Jeff's that we went back to Crimea to adopt the following year. And that was in February, March of 2014. And that's when the Russian army came in and took over Crimea. And so we had always prayed, Lord, if this isn't meant to be, you know, stop it. And it took the Russian army to come in and put an end to that adoption, because the Russians don't allow U.S. citizens to adopt. And so, you know, again, you just see the providence of God, and you learn to trust He knows what's best.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's so many stories, and again, I don't think adoption, you're not circumventing God's will at all. You know, God works through this, but I feel like our family is exactly what God intended for it to be. And we, the same thing, our very first attempted adoption did not go through, but it was because of that we had a contact with an attorney. And our, you know, Hannah and Kira were not adopted through Sacred Selections. We didn't know about them yet. I'm not sure they existed yet. But it was because of that failed first adoption that an attorney had our name and had our number, who called us up when Hannah was born and said, I have this other child now. You know, I had a contact with you, and I think that was just the way it was supposed to be. We had one sibling group that it fell through, but you know, things happen the way God wants them to happen, and you have to trust in that. And He does form these families. So again, more stories that we could tell, but very much in God's providence being something that we've learned to trust in. Learning patience every step along the way. I think, again, our experiences are different. Some of our special needs that we've dealt with. Dr. Hamilton mentioned the time that Stephanie was out in California. Jonathan, you know, was born early as well. Jonathan was not in a very good situation medically. Spent 5 months in the ICU in California while we're here. So we live here in Tampa. He was born in Sacramento, California. We already had Hannah and Kira. They're in school. I'm teaching here and doing everything that a teacher does. And for 5 months, Stephanie's trying to go back and forth to California. I'm trying to go several times back and forth to California. The raising of the children. I mean, there's on so many different levels. But we've had to learn patience and learn, again, to trust in these things to happen in His time and in His way, that He'll provide. I think yours is maybe a little different with some of the patience and what you've had to deal with.
Well, children will teach you patience no matter what
Anyway.
form they come in. When you adopt older children, obviously there are issues. Ami and Andrew were 5 and 2 when they were first adopted, and even that young, there's consequences to even a very young age, perception of being rejected. And this with families that divorce, the kids always think daddy would have stayed, or mommy and daddy would have stayed together if I'd been better, or if I'd been prettier or smarter or whatever it is. And of course that's not true, but they can't help kind of but feel that way. And then of course Rebecca was 12, and Jeff and Nick were 16 and 17. So it's you just realize they're different places and need different things, and you got to take people where they are. And that kind of leads into the last point that I would say about humility. That kind of goes along with the patience. The most difficult of all of the adoptions were the teenagers from Crimea, definitely. And what I would say is, with older children at least, it takes a good 3 years for the family really to adjust. All the current family members have to adjust. The new children you're integrating have to adjust. And that was a rough, 2 or 3 years with Jeff and Nick. But this is probably the most powerful lesson I have learned at all from the adoption process, is when I would try to tend to get frustrated, I just remind myself, they have not done one thing to me that I have not done to God 100 times over. And it's just a very humbling kind of recognition that, here I think I'm such a wonderful person and so lovable and this and that, and come to realize, no, I have a much better firsthand experience about what it's probably like for God to adopt some children who are not very lovable and require a lot of patience and a lot of help. But again, that's the choice. It's not a feeling that you get, but it's a choice to love, and that means to put your own self-interest aside and do what's best for them.
I don't know that I have much to add to that. Again, I would agree with that, different experiences that we have. Those were the lessons that we had, but we did want to open up. So did you have anything else you wanted to share right away, or see if there's some areas that you'd like us to talk more about? Because there's a lot of specifics we haven't gone into. We got lots of stories.
There's a saying that it's a marathon, not a sprint, so that's definitely something you have to keep in mind for adopting. No quick and easy solutions or shortcuts. So, yeah.
Anything y'all want to hear more about?
Another lesson we have learned is the number of foolish things that Christians will say.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately, but
I don't think I brought up in this talk.
nobody here.
I was told that I would never be able to be an elder because they weren't my kids. So, having faithful children, those aren't your children. Again, I don't think family has anything to do with biologically belonging to you. So, we will see some of those things that come out. I've also been impressed on the side of, one of the questions sometimes asked, will you have enough love to go around? Of course, that's a big family question too. People who think if you have more children, you're dividing your love up among all these children. Not true at all. Love multiplies. Love adds in the family. Every person who's added to the family, adds something more to it. And it's been wonderful to see. And I'll say also with the special needs kid, I've sometimes commented in the past, and maybe some of you heard it before, but when we first talked to Hannah and Kira about Jonathan, and that we're going to talk about this baby who was going to be born, and he was going to have special needs, and he was going to have some things that need to be cared for. Hannah, as a little girl, her very first response was, "He needs me, and I want him to be part of this family. He needs to be a part of this family, where we can take care of him and be part of that family." So, pretty neat to see. Questions? Nobody has questions? Yeah.
Who did you pray for the most that process of adoption?
Oh, what did we pray for the most about the process?
Well, I can answer that.
You answer that. You answer what
prayed
we
it all
prayed
the
for
time.
the most.
Yeah, okay, what the long story is. Because we were open to adopting older children, and we, again, don't know how to pick them. So we just pray for God's providence to bring us children that are resilient. Because I know there's some pretty damaged children out there that are probably beyond our capacity to help. But if there was a child that needed a home and that we could help that child, we just pray the Lord do what was best. And again, if it's to thwart the adoption and it falls through, we can be content with that. As long as we did our best and did what we could, and it just didn't work out, then we could live with that.
And I think our prayers matured. I think our prayers before the first adoption and our prayers before the fourth adoption were very different prayers. I just would have to admit. We just wanted a child. I mean, if you just talk about, in fact, Stephanie, she used to tease because she said she prayed so much during those. We've been married this August, will be 30 years. Hannah is 18. So that tells you we had a little while before we got Hannah. But she said, I prayed so much that I feel like it kind of got backlogged, and then God kept giving us kids. And she was like, no, I've stopped now praying for more children. It's just the backlog of the prayers coming in. That was enough. We'll stop at this point. But I think our prayers really became, God, please give us the children that we're supposed to have, that we can make a difference with. And again, in Providence, the right children that we can help and that can be a part of our family in that way. And that's hard. And it's hard when some of them fall through. Adoptive families go through a loss there. I'm sure it's not exactly the same thing as losing a baby physically when miscarriages and those, but emotionally you're still making that bond to a child. So that's a little bit difficult to deal with. Yeah.
When did y'all tell them that they're adopted?
We've celebrated it from day one with all of our children. And that idea of open adoptions or closed adoptions, we actually, and it's more because we got so many of them, we started losing track of the dates. We celebrated adoption day and the birthday with a lot of them when we first started. So just like we'd have a birthday party, we would have an adoption day party. And of course, it was pretty easy when your very first adoption is a transracial adoption. You're not hiding it. So there was never going to be. But we did that. We've been open to communication with the birth parents. The only request that we made with all of our birth parents is that all of the communication goes through us, not directly to our children, so that we could share it with them. But we've been open about that. And really, it's as they're getting older that we're more open about sharing some of that communication. Most of that drops off after a while, I'll have to say. There's a couple of the birth mothers that we still have some contact with through Facebook or something like that. We'll get a message every once in a while. There's a couple of them, we have no idea where they are. They've kind of disappeared, but we were very open with it from the very beginning. So you would be too.
Well, and I would say, I think it's foolish not to tell your child they're adopted. Because I think, number one, it's going to come out someday, somehow. You just count on it. And secondly, it's kind of implying there's something secondhand about adoption or nefarious or something to be ashamed of or something. And I think that feeds into this. There's almost a natural inclination of any child when they know they're adopted to, I need to find my real parents or my natural parents or, I think just being upfront and honest from the beginning and having that relationship is, so important.
Do you have any advice or stories about things that could have gone smoother in the legal process, like things you wish you'd done ahead of time to make the process like smoother in the future?
Our biggest hang-up had to do with home studies. Having a home study done, it's a necessary step if you're going to adopt. And we had at least one occasion where we knew we were going to want to adopt again, and we had not updated our home study. We didn't have a home study done, and then one of our children was born, and so we were behind the 8 ball on that. And as a result of that, Kira spent 3 weeks in foster care because we didn't have our home study done ahead of time. Now, we did get it done. It was frantic. We had to try to get somebody to do it last minute. But in us, that's the only part of like the legal process and the paperwork that I think we could have done differently. If you have any inclination that you think you're going to want to adopt at any time in the near future, I would go ahead and get a home study done and have that sitting there, because if a child comes up for adoption and you don't have that home study done, they can't place them with you. And so it can just cause a lot of problems. That'd be my aspect of
Yeah,
the legal.
that was always our hang up too. Of course, they're like $1,500. That was back then. I don't know what they are now, but, and they're good for like a year, so.
Then you pay till
You can update them again.
extend them.
And so I understand the hesitation of people if they don't know they're gonna adopt, but it's, a lot of times it's, put your name out there as someone who's willing to adopt, but a child will come up just as quickly as, birth, and peace and safety, and suddenly birth pains are upon you, So you do have to be ready to go once the child's available, so, and you just don't know, when that happens, so.
And sometimes people you deal with there, I mean, because Kira was already born and we were trying to get our home study done, I kept going back to the person that was doing the home study, and I was trying to kind of put a fire under them. She's been born. She's sitting in a foster home. The only reason we can't go to Florida and get her is we just need this home study done. As soon as you finish the home study, we can get in the car and drive to Florida. He got annoyed that I kept coming and kind of bothering him, and actually threatened me and said, if you don't leave me alone, I'll make this home study so you never get her. And so sometimes you're dealing with paperwork and people, sometimes people dealing in the system, but you've got to remember this is about getting a child. I mean, you could really get upset at some of these things. You could get upset at things lawyers do or social workers do, or even sometimes birth parents could do, but this is about this child that hasn't done anything. But that was the only other part of adoption, just it's very expensive. I don't understand why the system is the way it is with adoption. When you go to court, what's interesting as an adoptive parent, in the court proceedings, the adoptive parents have attorneys, the birth parents have attorneys, the child has an attorney who's appointed to represent the child, and you know who pays all the attorneys? The adoptive family. You're paying your attorney, you're paying the birth parent's attorney, and you're paying the attorney for the child. And that's just the way it works. But that's why there's these wonderful organizations like Sacred Selections to help with those things. Yeah.
What are some of the differences between domestic adoption and international?
You'll have to answer that because I've only done domestic.
Now, international is much more expensive. You have another adoption agency that's involved, and more costs in terms of travel. Plane ticket could be $1,000 one way. Like Ukraine had a requirement to, like when we were over there, we had to be gone for 8 weeks. And I was teaching here at Florida College. Unfortunately, I work at a place where they were very understanding, and the other guys in the Bible department filled in for me.
Yes, we did.
Yep, sure did. He was one of them. And it was exactly 8 weeks from a Friday to a Friday. And so that, and of course, that lodging and food you got to pay for. And I suspect a lot of ask no questions for conscience sake, money changing hands overseas. Here we just call it a tax, but there it's a more directly given to the person tax, which some might call a bribe, but I don't know that for sure, but some of that money. But that does increase the cost significantly. Like our first adoption, again, this was, 12 years ago. about $6,500 for all the legal work, and that was considered a simple adoption. And Jeff and Nick, it was more like $35,000.
Yeah, I think the only part domestically that can get tricky, out-of-state adoptions have a little bit
More lawyers.
Yeah, and the interstate compact. And so there's a chance that when you're adopting a child from out of state, when you go to pick up that child, you may be stuck in that other state for a little while for some paperwork reasons. Most adoptive families, I think, you need to plan that you may be there for a couple of weeks before you can come back home with your child. That has to do with, as the paperwork's being done, once a child leaves a state who's being adopted, that state no longer has responsibility for them. It's the state that you're coming back to that's going to have responsibility for this child if for some reason the adoption doesn't go through. So the state you want to come back to, the state you're leaving, they both want to be convinced that this is actually going to happen before they allow the child to pass over state lines. And so we dealt with that. Our first adoption was in Kentucky. She was born in Kentucky. That wasn't a problem. But then we had in Kentucky, born in Florida, and we had the interstate compact to deal with. And then we were in Florida, born in California. So that's the only, I think, tricky thing with that domestically. Yeah.
Have either of you ever thought about fostering with the intent to reunify?
To reunify back with the original family. We were very close to fostering under all conditions in Kentucky before we moved here. We were about a week away from finishing the courses that we had to do in Kentucky, and we just picked up and moved, and I would just have to say we've been so busy we never did that again. We've talked about fostering as our children get older. I don't know if you ever considered fostering with the goal of reuniting.
Yeah, and that has its own unique challenges because you care about the children, but ultimately, if they can be reunited with their family, I mean that's what you want, and you just hope the state isn't making a poor decision to send them back into a dysfunctional family that's setting them up for failure. But we just never, again, got around to it because. Once you have adopted a child, like I say, that next 2 or 3 years is a period of adjustment, and it's probably not the wisest thing to just bring in more and more distractions, or you get your attention divided, things like that. So that's kind of where we've been the past 12 years or so.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Oh, it's 9:03?
It's 9:03.
Well, thank you all for coming out, and so we can answer any questions
Or tell more
individually, of
stories.
course. We're here through the end of the semester.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.